I just thought it would be good to share that. Thank you for attending today's Sioux Falls Informational meeting, Sioux Falls City Council, Tuesday, November 10th. First item on the agenda today is City Council open discussion. Do we have any items for open discussion? Looking?
Yes, one.
Councilor Rolfing.
Councilor Kiley and Erickson and myself, along with our budget analyst, Dave Bixler. Did I say Karski?
You said Kiley.
Oh,
It's a K.
we don't.
It's close
No, we don't
enough.
want him. It's K. It's close enough. That's right. We're in National League of Cities last week. Well, they were there a little longer than I was, but I wanted to know when you would like us to give our reports.
I think that's something
No, I didn't bring my notes. And so I would look at that. We'd be entertained, or we'd be okay with giving it just about any time. Am I right?
Well,
so if you can arrange that, if we can arrange that on the informational schedule, that would be good. I can take a half an hour, and the other ones can have 5 minutes.
I'm sure we can work with. I'm sure we can work with leadership, Councilor Rolfing, to get that set up.
That would be good.
Okay.
That would be good.
Any other items, Councilor Jameson?
We have the topic of boulevards that's coming up in the near future. And over the last couple of weeks, I've had a couple of meetings with some individuals who were pretty vocal about it the last time we covered it, as well as some city staff regarding the issues. So it was just my intent and thought, and I want to share with the council and see if they agree, or well, it was pretty hot last time. But one of the things I was hoping to do was in land use, have it at one of our next land use meetings, open discussion. So it could inform the public and let everybody know about the meeting, give them a chance to weigh in, listen to what their concerns are, try to include those thoughts, and then the meeting the month afterwards of that meeting, we could have the language maybe written that included some of their thoughts and feelings, and as well as staff's and our own, to get ready for that land use to then review it again. So I'll leave it to the chair to determine those timelines, but it was really more about a process of making the public aware of a timeline that we're trying to get through this, as well as a timeline for them to come in and give us their public input. I think that's important for us to receive that in this process, because the boulevard generally is going to impact every person who lives in the town and our city. And so I want to take this process kind of slow. It has been already, but it's meant to be deliberative and be inclusive. So I wanted to share that with the council as an approach, and see if you have any objections with that moving forward.
Councilor Offenbach.
A couple things on that. One, some of the pushback that I'm getting is that folks don't understand the boulevards that they love that are decorated and landscaped already. They don't understand that those are illegal. And so they're saying to me, oh, please don't change the law. I love my boulevards the way they are. So I would just caution folks to understand that those are illegal right now, and that we want to have the conversation about figuring out how to make some version of that legal. And if we just say that as many times as possible. Then my other concern would be having public input during committee meetings. They're at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Not generally a great time for the public. I guess if we could figure out maybe a different time to do that, and maybe it's okay if we give them enough notice that people can, but it's been our experience with committee meetings that isn't when the public is generally available. And so I would ask my colleagues to consider the different time possibly for that conversation, but just my thoughts.
Councilor Karski.
Remember when we did the urban ag, I don't know if you have a separate committee, I don't know who's all working with you or who's all together, but we had several meetings at the library and that type of thing, and it wasn't a land use or public service. It eventually went there, but we did start with a committee, and we included representatives from the community, whether they're interested in pros or cons, or pros and cons, for that matter, of changes to the boulevard. You go along the lines of collaboration, such an overused word, but along the lines of getting input from everybody. It's a lot of extra work, but this is it's a tough one to tackle because it gets very emotional from a lot of sides, and you're not going to make everybody happy no matter what you do. But if, like you said, with a lot of input, it might go further. So I don't want to be on the committee, but no.
Councilor from Bach?
And after I said that, as Councilor Karski's talking, I remember saying to Councilor Jameson, let's not make any extra meetings if possible, and let's not have another separate group. So, because I would like to just start it as a conversation. I think he's spot on when it comes to that, but I just wonder if maybe it's a Tuesday night when we don't have a normal meeting. There's sometimes those fifth Tuesdays or something like that, just to kind of keep it, let that open conversation happen, but like you said, I don't want to be on the committee. There's a lot of people who don't want to be on the committee, but we got to have that opportunity for that conversation to happen too. So I'm just saying, let's think differently about it and figure out how we can have that conversation with folks and just kind of start it and roll easily from there. So,
Councilor Kiley.
Councilor Jameson and I have discussed this very topic, and it is we are both interested in bringing it forward to land use. It will not happen next week because we do have 3 topics on the schedule already, but we do hope to make it a priority for the following month, but which will give us time also in the meantime to discuss ways in which we can get that input, because you can correct me if I'm wrong, Councilor Jameson, I don't know that we necessarily want to put together another ad hoc committee or anything of that nature, but we are interested in getting public input on this particular issue so that we can move forward and we could move forward in a positive direction.
Councilor Jameson?
Right, very good, thank you. I think that's very good. I think let's approach with caution and maybe think about another time for the public to have a chance to give us input other than during the work hours of a day. And we'll think through that. And we'll work it through, and then maybe at our next meeting we could talk about that kind of a timeline so everything just unfolds pretty slow, but at least everybody will give good notice, and we'll think of another time to kind of incorporate other feelings here too. So very good, thanks.
And as I'm a member of land use also, I'm very open to having this discussion moved outside of the council chambers. And if we have to go out to the public for a couple small meetings or something, I'm very open for that too, to get that public testimony. So I encourage you, Councilor Kiley, as our chair, when we have our next meeting, probably make that part of our open discussion.
I think with that we can discuss this amongst ourselves and with leadership and come up with a good direction to go. Because again, we are interested in getting the input from the public, and certainly having this addressed by next spring, next growing season, and do it in I guess a prudent fashion as well too.
Sure. Okay, any other items for open discussion? Seeing none, we'll move on to the presentation. Today we have Shape Places, and Mike Cooper, our Director of Planning, will be our presenter.
Good afternoon, Mike Cooper with Planning and Building Services. Also joining me today, Shauna Goldhammer, representing our zoning office. This is going to be a non-presentation presentation, but I wanted to have more of a discussion today about some items that maybe you have come up with the council, with others, and kind of going back and forth and seeing if there's some other future directions that you would like us to go with our zoning ordinance. But just in terms of a introduction, to recall that when we initially approved Shape Places in March of 2013, then we went through the referendum process. During that year, between March of 2013 and April of 2014, the city council approved 43 different rezoning items. After April of 2014, when we began implementing Shape Places, we've done probably twice that many zoning revisions for the council. So the point is that we had a lot of zoning items under the 83 ordinance, and we continue to have those zoning items under Shape Places. Obviously, we've gone through now 3 record years of building construction. So starting in 2013, when we were still using the 83 ordinance, and then moving into 14 and now 15, I don't believe that the zoning ordinance itself has had an impact on the level of construction activity. We're still seeing those permits coming in for both residential and non-residential projects. We also talked about, at the time we initially discussed the Shape Places with the council and with the public, that we anticipated, because of the comprehensive nature of this ordinance, that there was going to be periodic revisions, amendments, as we began implementing it. And so over that past year or so, we have brought forth language clarifying things like the buffer yard requirements, screening, the public notification, signage. We also did a complete update of our billboard regulations. We worked on an updated downtown initial development plan. And we've done some special areas such as the USD Discovery District. So that's all part of a kind of a comprehensive continuation in terms of implementation of the Shape Places zoning ordinance. Going forward, some of the things that we're going to begin working on would be some updated downtown design standards, which is one of the recommendations of our downtown 2025 plan. We're going to be working on some new floodplain requirements with our revised flood hazard boundary maps. And then recently, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that is going to impact nationwide local jurisdictions that have sign ordinances in terms of the type of signs, the content of those signs. We're still kind of vetting through what impact that's going to have, but that could also come back and require us to amend our ordinance. As an example, during elections, we allow election signs to go up temporarily a certain number of days before and after an election. In looking at the Supreme Court ruling, we cannot distinguish between the content of the sign. So in other words, with that ruling, you could potentially have a temporary sign in your front yard, and we could not prohibit that. As long as we're allowing temporary signs, we can't discriminate as far as what the content of those signs are. So we're still going through that whole discussion, and there'll be more work that we have to go forward with that. But I would say overall, I'm pleased with the implementation of the zoning ordinance and the intent of it as far as what we were initially trying to accomplish. But I do have a list of topics that maybe we could just go through today as a discussion, and then if you have others or things that you would like us to go back and review, we can sure do that. And these are in no particular order of priority, but one was the question about when does staff bring forward a staff-initiated rezoning request? Because we have been doing some of those since we implemented Shape Places. And I would say that in my years with the city, we have done that throughout the use of our zoning ordinance. Typically, when we find that there's a zoning designation that does not match up with the existing land use, either because there was a change in the use or that there was some new information that we were not aware of, then we will typically bring those forward and say we want to rezone this in conformance with the current land use. Or if we find that there was a mistake in the way that the zoning was designated, then we would bring those forward. And another example would be when we're initiating, for instance, the rail yard, the downtown rail yard, we brought that into the downtown designation. So that was a staff-initiated rezoning. Those will continue in the future, but if you have any questions of as far as is there specific criteria that we use or that we would try to continue to look at in the future to bring those forward, but I can say that those will continue to come to you on a, not necessarily a regular basis, but as we discover them, we will package those together and bring those forward. So maybe I'll just stop with each subject and see if you have any questions or comments. Yep, go ahead.
Councilor Erickson?
When you just said the staff-initiated rezone request, is that something that then that landowner has to pay, or what fees are?
Yeah, we don't require the fees. We do the posting of the signs, but we do notify the property owner, and we do get their authorization.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, that's it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Councilor Jameson?
On the staff-initiated ones, what I may be sensing is that there were errors made with the rezoning, and the staff initiates the change because they found the error, and the landowner doesn't necessarily even know of it, perhaps, or even is aware that there was a change with the shaped places. So I just found it important that you state somehow that it is staff initiated versus somehow saying that it isn't, or omitting that, or just giving us the facts that it doesn't include that detail. I think it's important for us just to recognize that there is a change being made by staff because...
and then give the reason for it.
Yeah.
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
Councilor Offenbach?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. My first is a comment, though, that change is hard. This is a huge, huge project, and it's difficult for us to kind of get our arms around it. So I just appreciate you continuing to patiently walk us through this, because it's a big deal. My question then has to do with sort of the grander vision of what Shaped Places is and what it's about, and that whole the 25-year plan and the sorts of the things that are coming alongside this. Can we talk about that now, or is that not an appropriate conversation for now? Is that what you're prepared to do, or you just want to talk specifics about the ordinance?
Let me go through the specifics, and then we'll come back to that. This is your time.
Thanks.
But let me make a note to come back to that.
Councilor Rolfing?
Thank you. Mike, it seems to me as my time in these seats up here, the last 5.5, 6 years, that we've had two major areas that are bones of contention, if you will. One is alcohol and video lottery placement, and secondly, our big box stores. I'm wondering if those can be whittled out, if you will, and maybe always need a conditional use permit so that they come before us, and we could do it that way, if that would be one solution, so that they're not just kind of automatically, rubber stamped, and because they happen to fall in this little area, and it may be just a little bit different than what we thought, but we got there, and then we could maybe take care of some initiatives or referendums or whatever, and referrals, and before they get started.
I actually had those on my list, but I'll skip to those right now. Okay, let's talk about conditional use permits for alcohol, because we just had a meeting about that. Are you asking specifically about video lottery? Because we do not have the authority to regulate those like we tried at one time. But what I have heard maybe is concerns about concentration of alcohol establishments. Is there something that we could do about that or look at that? Is that related to your question or not?
That would be the kind of thing.
Okay.
Can we use the CUP to
Right. Rather than just saying, how close are you to residential, but how close are you to other alcohol establishments?
Right.
Okay.
And then by putting a CUP on them, they need to come to us.
Yes.
Rather than just, I don't mean rubber stamp, but just they fit all the criteria just right, so they just go on through.
Okay, because that, and I'll say the same thing for the large retail uses, that if we do go through a conditional use permit process. Let's just go back to alcohol, the concentration of alcohol uses. If we put together a standard and say, if you're within X number of feet, then you have to go through a conditional use permit. What are the requirements that you're going to be reviewing to make a decision on whether to approve or deny that request? Because that's part of the CUP challenge that we've had before, was that in some cases we had criteria, and even if you met the criteria, you could still get turned down because of public opposition. So that would be something that we would have to look at in more detail, is what are the criteria that you're going to use as a council to discuss those? And we could.
Yeah, 1, 2,
have
3,
that.
4,
Yep.
and, yep.
And the same thing with a large retail. That's why we took that out of Shea Places, was because the situation that a developer would come forward with a request for a conditional use permit for X number of feet of a retail use. They had to do a traffic impact study. They had to put together drawings, and they spent money doing all that. In their minds, they met all the requirements of the conditional use permit ordinance. But then when it got to the public hearing, it was still denied because of some other reason. That's what we had tried to avoid by saying, with Shea Places now, zoning matters rather than a conditional use permit. So when you go through a zoning change, then we know up front what's going to be allowed or not allowed, and you don't have to worry later on about the unknown of whether something's going to get approved. So that's a long answer to that, but that was the criteria that we looked at before.
It's something to work through, I think.
Yep.
These are possibilities. I'm just making the suggestions so that we can look at them and talk about them.
Okay.
Councilor Kiley?
Well, this generated, I guess, another comment, but I'll go to my first. Of the staff-initiated, and getting back to that, the staff-initiated rezoning items that we have dealt with, sometimes it might seem like we're dealing with a lot of those because we're dealing with 1 or 2 a night, or maybe even 2 or 3, or maybe even 4 or 5 in a single evening. But what percentage of properties does that actually represent out there? I mean,
It's pretty small.
how many could we have? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, and we're dealing with 1 or 2 or 3.
I think we've used the number around 60,000 properties.
Right. So
Overall, but-
percentage-wise, what we're doing and the corrections we're making represents a very small percent of what's actually out there. So I just would encourage my colleagues to keep that in mind as well, too. We knew going forward with Shea Places that it would require some tweaking, and I think that's what we are doing. And I think we just need to stay with that process. And regarding the conditional use permits, I guess I have a little concern over that, basing, okay, we'll grant it based on this conditional use permit here, but we're not going to grant it here. I'm one that let's create the policy or the standard, and then let's make sure that we adhere to that. And if it's necessary to, in terms of alcohol, to put in something similar to what we have with our off-premise signs, that only so many are allowed within X number of feet of one another, then let's do so. But I'm not quite sold that the conditional use permit is the way to go.
Councilor Jameson?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the conditional use on a big box was always an issue from the beginning with Shea Places. That big box has such an impact on the area. It's like a nuclear engine or something. It's just so big that I think a conditional use is required only for that one, not all the other ones, because I think the purpose and method behind the Shea Places has a lot of good purpose. But it's just that large C4 that needs the conditional use, I think, in all cases. That's just my opinion.
But again, if you're going to have a conditional use permit requirement, you have to decide what criteria you're going to use to decide if it's.
And fair enough, maybe
approved or not.
that whole conditional use part needs to be clarified.
Yep. Because if it meets the requirements and you still vote it down, then you're subject to a lawsuit by doing it that way too. So you have to be careful. And that's why we put together the buffer yard requirements. We still have the traffic impact requirements and some of those. But yeah, I understand
Yeah, clearly,
discussion. Yep.
clearly it's caused a disruption in our community in several cases. So we need to do something there. I guess that's maybe, if anything, we recognize, I think you have, that something needs to be fixed or changed.
And that, again, you can interrupt me, but another related subject as we're talking about that was the whole area of neighborhood transitions and buffer yard requirements. We had a little bit of that with our West 41st Street issue with Billions, but we're going to put together a chart that Jim had asked us to do. We have 4 different levels of buffer yards, and they vary from 10 feet to 45 feet in width, and then the different landscaping, berming requirements. And we can put together a visual that you could look at to say, okay, here's the difference, and here's when each one is required. It goes back to that compatibility chart. The higher the compatibility, the smaller the buffer yard. The less compatibility, the greater the buffer yard. We had a situation just recently that was brought to us on East 10th Street for a redevelopment of an existing commercial property, and it's adjacent to a residential. So the buffer yard requirement is 30 feet. Well, right now, the setback of the existing commercial use is 0. The commercial use goes right up to the residential property line. So with the redevelopment, we said, okay, now you have to follow shaped places, you have to have a 30-foot buffer yard. And the initial plan that they brought to us, they said, well, there's no way we can make this work. And we actually sat down and went through it with them, and we've shown them a way that they can make it work with their redevelopment idea. So there are cases where that is going to work without having to rezone further into the neighborhood. But some of the other situations that we've brought to you, you know, the new building is going to be larger, there's more parking requirements, there is more setback requirements. And so in those cases, the applicant is asking to rezone more property to make the new business fit. Another example of that a while back was the Freedom gas station on West 12th Street that we had to, or we were asked to rezone some residential property behind the old gas station. So those transitional areas we would continue to look at, and I know that we've been asked, do we have a guideline that we look at or use to say, okay, is this a good area for a transition, or is this not a good area? And is that something that you as a council would like us to see, would like us to do more work on for the future? You know, West 10th Street, West 41st Street, those areas that we're seeing some of those transitions occur.
Councilor Offenbach?
You know, I for one would. So many of those transition areas are in the Central District, which are my neighbors. Yeah. And so I'd like to see that. The other comment I would make that just occurred to me is that you were talking about, in particular, 41st and Minnesota. During that process where we kind of pushed back against that, the Billion Corporation, I got calls from people who own property at other intersections saying, now wait a minute, we're doing this, thinking in the future we're going to do the same kind of thing. Should we back off? And the conversation I had was that, you know, keep your neighbors informed, you know, work with staff and be ready to have those meetings with people and be, you know, be okay with taking that process slow. But it just is one of those ideas that people have to understand there's more to it than just, oh yeah, boom, we're done, we're switching the zoning. And I think that would be really helpful for them and for me to say, yep, here's the things we look at when we're looking at an intersection that's going to get a little more commercial. Here's what we look at. That'd be great help.
And if I can jump in on that, Mike, thank you for bringing up like West 10th Street. You know, as we look in the future, wanting to make that more retail and commercial, how far back into those residentials are we going to go? And especially between, you know, I'm looking at between Grange and Minnesota, you know, on the north side there, we're really talking about, you know, maybe impacting some historical district area too. So and that is a definite discussion we need to have and be updated on, I think, on those main corridors and how we're moving back into those residentials and the buffers and that. I think that would be great conversation. Any other questions at this time, or Mike, if you'd like to continue then?
Well, let's go back to, well, let me first of all ask, are there other specific subjects that you had a question about before we go back to Councilor Erpenbach's big vision question? Anything that comes to mind right now that I didn't touch on? Okay. So let's go back. If you want to rephrase your question again, then I'll try to begin that discussion.
Right. I kind of have a couple of questions that have come up with some neighborhood folks that I'm working with right now. And it has to do sort of with that, it kind of weaves into the idea of the downtown aesthetics plan. You know, is there then a vision for what neighborhoods look like as they, you know, sort of ripple out from downtown? How do those neighborhoods look in a future? Is there a grand vision for that? And if there isn't, should there be? You know, and then my second question, kind of related to that, is do we have enough staff people for the size of community that we are? In terms of planning and zoning, do we have enough folks that can handle those kinds of really kind of the visionary things that are laid out in that, you know, that 2025 plan or whatever the next sort of design phase is? And so those are kind of my grand questions, and then I had a couple other kind of more specific.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with downtown and then work our way into the adjoining neighborhoods. Again, with our downtown 2025 plan, we put together an implementation committee, which is led by Dustin Powers with community development. And within the main goals and objectives of the downtown plan, we've identified different organizations that should take the lead on implementation. And one of the key outcomes of that was we need to look at our downtown design standards. And so the Planning and Zoning Office is taking the lead on that. We've had some open houses. We've had some meetings with different design people within the community. And actually, as part of the upcoming Neighborhood Summit, we're going to be talking about that as well. Specific to the neighborhoods, you know, we do have the Pettigrew Heights neighborhood plan. We have a Whittier neighborhood plan, Cathedral. We've done a lot of that over the years. But when we see that they're getting maybe close to 5 to 10 years, then we need to come back and kind of refresh them and look at them. One of the most current issues that we're talking about would be the type of housing that we should be allowing within older neighborhoods. Some of those are historic district neighborhoods and some of them are not. But in terms of a vision for these neighborhood transition areas, things like the Minnesota Avenue Corridor, the Weber Avenue Corridor, the Pettigrew Heights neighborhood plan, those are big vision things that maybe we need to bring back to the council to refresh your memory as far as what do they talk about and how are they being pursued as far as implementation, if that would be helpful. And then maybe getting more participation with some of the newer neighborhood associations that have kind of formed recently.
If I might, Mr. Chair, that would be helpful to council, and then it reminds us, but it also then reminds the public that those kinds of things are going on. I guess the next one on the checklist then would be the All Saints neighborhood,
yes,
which is just right here. You know, they're at a point where, and you kind of started the conversation now, they're very concerned about the kinds of housing that is being allowed or not allowed in their neighborhood, as is the folks who are not exactly in either neighborhood between Pettigrew and Cathedral, very concerned about the kinds of housing that are being allowed to be built in those areas. And so that is part of the conversation for these folks, is that they really need to understand that either one, there isn't a vision and we'd like to work on one, or two, there is a vision and here's what it looks like and we'd like input on it, you know, or whatever. We need to be at that point where people feel like they have input in that, what their neighborhood looks like.
But we are partnering with community development to work
Right.
on those projects. So it's not just us by ourselves. Yep.
Right, exactly. And so then in that, either in the 2025 plan or in the Sioux Falls, it must be the 2025 plan. Everything has a name and
Well, we
they're all
have
getting
our
messed up.
citywide comprehensive plan is called Shape Sioux Falls.
Shape Sioux Falls, I knew, that's what I was looking
go.
for. I knew it had the city name in it. My question is specifically about neighborhood conservation districts. That's one of those sort of dream, sort of vision projects that doesn't really exist yet, but would that be helpful? Are we ready to take that step?
Well, there is an
that
entire
vision.
chapter of the Shape Sioux Falls that talks about neighborhood conservation areas. We've identified about 10 of those. And so again, we've been working with some of them more than others, but yeah, that's something that we've been historically paying attention to, and now that we're going to be getting more involved specifically with some of these more, some of the neighborhoods that are more adjacent to the downtown area.
Right. And just one more, if I might, Mr. Chair. I just then wanted to reiterate, and you and I have had that conversation, and you said it a few minutes ago. I really want us to understand more clearly and to be more intentional about how we issue building permits, especially in the core area of the city, where neighborhoods are established as a certain kind of neighborhood, and where we're not. There are several examples at this point of those permits being issued to houses or to structures that do not fit the neighborhood and have created all sorts of issues. And we all know of the one, but there are several in the Central District in particular. And it's difficult for the neighbors when a home is built. It's a beautiful home, but it doesn't fit the character of the neighborhood. It doesn't fit the style. And I would argue that resale value would be a little sketchy in some of those neighborhoods if you're building something like that. So I want that to continue to be on our front burner. I really want that to be something that we figure out how to be intentional about those permits. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'd also like to, if I may, jump in on that also to make a comment. As we do look at these older neighborhoods and we talk aesthetics and that, we also have to remember that property rights are involved here too, and that people can build what they want if it's within our city rules. And you know, it's to try to put a stigmatism on one type of housing or another, I think would be very unfair, and especially in these older neighborhoods where you already have a multiple style of housing, you know, to very, very old, you almost want to talk shanty type of housing, and you know, building and trying to update. And I would always say that, you know, our first objective would be to remodel, but if we can't remodel, then we have to take a look at, you know, the next steps that we can take. And also, our core area is where our most affordable housing is. And as the city develops, and as our hospitals are developing, as we see, it's at nobody's fault, but that core area is being eaten up. And we've done nothing up to this point to replace those affordable housing. And whether we do it within the older neighborhoods or have to create new neighborhoods to replace that, we're going to have to address that too. So.
Might I respond, Mr. Chair, just directly to that? I don't disagree one bit. I absolutely agree that it is about property rights and it is about being able to choose the kind of house that I build. But the other side of it is that the smaller houses next door, we're having both ends of the spectrum happening in this community, right? The houses that are smaller, that are next door, and there are many examples of this, not just the one that's making the headlines, many examples where that large house is being built in such a way that it is precluding the livability of the homes next to it.
Councilor Jameson?
It's interesting listening to the issues at different parts of the community. They're different than, you know, like the Southwest District and others that are around on the fringe with growing areas. So what came to my mind listening was the issue of the neighbors not knowing what land is zoned. So they move into a new development area, they build their home, only to realize later that they had no clue that there was going to be a something commercial, highly dense use near them. What would be a way to improve awareness to every individual who, you know, builds out into a new development near vacant, empty land? I think that's the worst one, is the vacant land. If there's already an existing use, they might know that, well, that's kind of likely to be something similar. But do you have any thoughts about how we could, would it be maybe during the building permit process that they somehow get a note that says, do you know that you are building near some commercial? I don't know. Have you had any thoughts about that? I know you've been challenged with it like us.
Yeah, it's a double one. If it's vacant land and it's it hasn't gone through a zoning change, then it's even more unclear sometimes what could potentially happen. I know that we do get asked on a regular basis by, whether it's a homeowner or a church search committee or whatever it might be, or a developer, what's going to happen to this land around X location? And we can give them some general guidelines as far as what our land use policies would be. But to say specifically it's going to be X amount of square feet of this use is a little challenging. If the property has already gone through a zoning approval, then it's a little easier to say, okay, here's what has been approved and here's what potentially is going to happen to that property when construction does begin. But I think in terms of working with, we're getting more neighborhood associations, given most of them are in the core area, but there might be a way that we could work through, whether it's our permitting process or just through the Home Builders Association or others, of maybe getting some general information out that might be
Right,
helpful.
one of the challenges I've heard is somebody says, well, the realtor told me it would never
Yes.
be this, or
We hear that a lot too.
the builder said it would never be, or somebody said, my neighbor said it would never be.
Yeah.
I just would challenge, all of us, or you more so, I guess, on how to maybe bridge that gap, because, boy, that would really save us a lot of challenges later if it was just definitive some way, but.
Okay, we'll put some more thought into that question. That's a good one.
Any other questions at this time? Okay. Mike, if you'd like to continue, do we have more to move on to?
I do not have a lot of other items. I was asked about, I know you had asked about the zoning board of adjustment,
Yes, sir.
and just make a quick comment about that for people that are not familiar with. Separate from the planning commission, we have a zoning board of adjustment, and by statute, there are specific areas that they are being petitioned to consider request. The primary one would be a variance request. Most of our variance requests would be pertaining to setbacks of buildings, structures. Another one that we might get involved with would be reduction of parking requirements. But the vast majority of these are building setback requests. And we do go through the similar public notification and posting of signs and public hearing before the zoning board of adjustment. The big difference between that board and, say, the planning commission is that the board of adjustment is considered a quasi-judicial board, so if you appeal their decision, it goes to circuit court. It does not go to city council. So that gives them a lot more, a higher level of standard that they have to follow when they're making their decision. They have to put together what they call findings of fact. Typically, they have to determine if there's a hardship or some unusual configuration of the property that would say that this variance is applicable for this request versus any other property in the city. So they go through a little more scrutiny, as well as our zoning enforcement staff, in looking at how those cases are brought forward. But that's just kind of a real quick overview of the kind of things that they would get involved with. And maybe you have a follow-up question to that one, Counselor.
Well, on that, you said that they have to show a hardship. And on the one that we were discussing, there was no hardship, but there was other parts of that. There was no hardship if it was approved either. And I guess that's sort of what I'm looking at, is that if you have, a project that you have neighborhood support and that there would be no hardship as far as traffic or safety to make that addition in an older neighborhood especially. I'm curious on how are we using shaped places? Are we using the older ordinance when those neighborhoods were actually created? Because they're built much differently than what our neighborhoods are constructed now.
Yep.
And I just feel that sometimes I know it's a real big gray area on how we look at those, but I guess that's another discussion to have is, how do we rezone, or how do we take care of those requests in those older neighborhoods. You know, that we keep looking at some of the issues that we have today as far as with buildings and reconstruction in those older neighborhoods. And I think another one of those small points that comes up that needs to be taken a look at, because a lot of times there is no impact and they're being turned down.
We did put together a specific district for the core area neighborhoods. It's called the Single Family Residential for Historic Preservation. It has different kinds of standards, smaller lot size, those kind of things that would apply. But let's just say that the minimum side yard requirement would be 5 feet. That's pretty typical. And I want to come in and put an addition onto an older home or modify the garage so that I can get my car inside my garage. And I have to have a 3-foot setback to make that work. The neighbors are not opposed to it. They've got a building plan that works. And so then we look at it and we say, okay, technically, how does it meet the test of a variance? And that's some of the discussion that we would go through. So, but I understand what you're asking about, and I think we can continue to go back and maybe look at what the standards would be to make it more viable for some of these infill developments. And it gets back to Councilor Erpenbach's discussion too about what are these older neighborhoods going to look like in terms of the transition. We know that we want to encourage redevelopment. It has to fit in with what's there. And so how do we make those pieces work together? And that's what a note that I'm making that we can go back and take another look at.
Exactly. There was other, aspects to that, as there was no sidewalk. So there was actually extra property that could have been looked at as far as that setback. And actually looking from the curb, maybe there was maybe about 15 to 20 extra feet. So that's just something. Councilor Erickson.
Questions in regards to what Councilor Anderson is talking about, because I think that we might even be talking about maybe the same example that you're bringing up. I've had a really lengthy conversation about a specific example in regards to the Board of Adjustments. First question is, and maybe I didn't hear it, is Board of Adjustments, is that Shaped Places, or was it in place before what is that?
The Board of Adjustment has been in place since the 1950s.
Okay. So it's not Shaped Places?
Well, they used the Shaped Places zoning ordinance, but the Shaped Places did not create the Board of Adjustment. That was already in place.
There before, okay.
Yep.
So my other question, I understand that they're under extra scrutiny, and I understand that they need to be held to a higher standard. And I think sometimes when you say, well, they have an out, they have an appeal to the circuit court, that's a great avenue. However, at the same time, it's also for some, maybe this example that I'm discussing is kind of like, oh, we lost. Why take it to the next level when it was probably something that could have maybe been delayed or made some adjustments. For example, one of the things is their current garage was on that 4-point something area, and so it should have been maybe grandfathered in and not even part of the conversation. And the other conversation, they got the neighborhood support, they had an attorney, they dotted their I's, crossed their T's, and it's a one-bedroom, one bedroom, one garage with a family that's growing, and for them to reinvest in the core is huge. It's fantastic. I mean, that's a great deal. They're not talking about building a $500,000-$600,000 house and have it sticking out like a sore thumb, but they're talking about reinvesting in the core to make sure it continues to be updated and look great and not crumble from the insides out. And I just feel like we need to somehow figure out a way to work with people. This is not in regards to the one that was in the headlines or anything of that sort, but their garage was already past that 5 feet, and that was there before they bought it. It's just unfortunate with that, and I have lots more other questions, I guess, about the Board of Adjustments that I wasn't necessarily prepared to ask today, but I'd love to talk more about that.
Yeah, we can get together and do that.
With it being quasi-judicial, is it a recorded or it's a recorded board?
Yes.
That goes there?
Yes.
All right. We'll have to talk more about it. I have lots of questions.
I think we've gone through phases over the years where the Board of Adjustment basically approved everything that came to them, and then, you know, we've gone through other phases where they were a lot more strict as far as what they approved, and you know, we rely on our city attorneys to give us guidance on that, as well as the statutes that they have to follow. So it's not a perfect process. These are all citizen volunteers that come in and do this, and so, yeah, it's an interesting group.
One follow-up, if I may. If this example chooses to not appeal to circuit court, when can they come back? Because for us, if we choose to not vacate a road or we choose to not rezone, they're back in front of us in 6 months, oftentimes with very little change, if no change at all. So, for example, I want a variance. I get denied. I'm not going to circuit court because I'm not going to spend the time, money, and energy for it. What do I do? Can I come back to Board of Adjustment again? I can't go to the council.
You could come back, but if it was the same request, you probably would get the same answer. So in that situation, we've done this. I mean, I personally got involved in these where we sit down and say, okay, here's a way to make it work.
Right.
And sometimes even during a board meeting, the board members will say, well, here's a way to make it work by reducing the amount of the variance or even eliminating the variance. So we can have those discussions too. But what occurs in many cases is that, let's just say the homeowner, they've already taken the time to sit down with their builder or their architect or whatever, and they've already locked in, here's what I need to have done. And so they bring it to us and say, here's what we need to have done, and they've kind of gone past the opportunity to have other options presented to them. So, but that's another way to deal with them in some cases.
Okay, well, I'll just encourage
Sure.
them to not just take no as an answer and to have the conversation with
Right.
your department to talk about what additional changes that they can make in this instance. And I think that's a good example for others that may want a variance, that it's not always going to work, but what options and what can we talk about
Yes.
to make it work and continue to redevelop and continue to reinvest in the core.
Very good.
And if I may, one more last thing, and then Councilman Jameson. On that, Mike, when you talk about the appeals process, you know, every day we hear about our courts being overloaded and everything, and with cases, whether it's civil or criminal. Is there any other way that we could do the appeals?
That's based on state law.
State law?
Yeah, it's state. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Jameson?
Thank you. Mike, it's real good to have you come and talk to us. You know, there's a lot of all the work we do on the city council, rezoning is a big part of it, and I think these conversations really help. For the longer you talk, though, the more I'm thinking about questions.
That's good.
So one that came to mind is the concept of shape places and shape Sioux Falls in general. This idea that we've had items come in front of us for rezones that were clearly like, no way that works, just a bad idea. And others that have come through that makes sense. And then others that never get to us because maybe they didn't get or don't get staff approval or recommendation. And some of the comments that we hear where they were shut down or they were denied from the city staff of the rezone that they wanted to do. And one of the things that I keep hearing about is this mirroring an intersection. Take any intersection like 41st Minnesota kind of thing, and you want all the corners to kind of be equal in commercial use or whatever use that's there. And as they grow or move on, you kind of want to keep them equal. How big of an impact is that keeping it equal versus just a good idea and somebody who wants to redevelop or develop vacant land? How do you use that parameter of balancing the corners in the big scheme of things?
Okay, that's a good question. I would just, to start out with, when we get approached initially by a property owner, a developer, or whatever, here's what I'm thinking about doing with this property. What do you think about it? Would you support it? That happens almost on a weekly basis. And so we look at our land use standards, our guidelines, and say, here's the here's our opinion on if we think it would work, if it's in compliance with our comprehensive plan and our zoning ordinance, then we believe that we would be able to support this going forward. We would also tell them if we don't think it, we would support it, and we would typically tell them why. If they want to do something that would be out of character with a neighborhood, we've told people that we would not support that. It still gives them the right to take it forward if they want to pay the application fee and go through all that. We always make a staff recommendation on every item. And what's interesting is that when we do our staff report, in most cases it's prior to a neighborhood meeting or prior to the Planning Commission public hearing. And so when you get to that level, there may be information that you're not aware of or new information that comes from the neighborhood or the developer even that maybe would say, well, if we had this information at the beginning, maybe we would have come up with a different recommendation. And I'll use the classic Jameson case, which is the 12th and Discovery. When that item came to us, based on our land use criteria, we said, yes, we could support this infill development. When it got to the neighborhood hearing, obviously there was a huge amount of opposition. So then the developer was asked, well, would you consider going back and modifying it based on what you've heard? They've done that, and now it's going to be coming back to you for a second review. So that can happen as well. There's not a magic formula in every case, but again, I would say that based on the last 2 years of permits and building projects, when you're looking at the level of construction that we see in our community, I would say that the number of cases that maybe are contentious is still pretty small. And I also think that we've had a very good relationship over the years between the Planning Commission and the City Council. You can find very few cases where there's been a difference of opinion. It doesn't mean that you have to rubber stamp everything that they say or that we say, but I think we're putting a lot of thought into our recommendation, and we don't hit the mark every time, but we do a fairly decent job.
Councilor Kiley?
Mike, I'm not sure about my colleagues. Maybe there's still going to be other questions, but maybe in an effort to help you summarize, shaped places, the thought behind shaped places, isn't it true that it was, hopefully it would provide consistency and clarity to the zoning process as it's implemented throughout the city? Okay. And
Yes.
I, as a homeowner, would appreciate that because I can buy my property and look at how properties around me are zoned and have reasonable awareness of what may or may not be developed near me. And the same would hold true for the individual developer builder too. They could buy the property and know what they can put in based on the shaped places zoning ordinance regulations. Whereas with the previous policies, and especially with the conditional use permits, if I bought my property, there was always that chance that the individual that bought the adjoining property might request this conditional use, and this conditional use, and depending upon their team of lawyers or how much effort they put into it, maybe they were going to be successful where others were not successful. And so as a homeowner, I wasn't really quite sure or didn't have that same amount of certainty as to what might go in. I guess my question is, and I'm not asking for opinion because I think you can base it on your experience in the last year and a half. Has shaped places worked that way? Has it provided the consistency and the clarity to the process that did not exist previously?
I think it has. I would say that the two areas that we continue to have the most discussion would be going from vacant land to some type of multifamily or commercial, primarily in the newer development areas, but also in the neighborhood transition areas. Whenever you're changing a zoning classification or a land use from vacant or residential to multifamily or commercial, that's when you get the most public interest and debate. And again, that's why we came up with these new zoning classifications, the buffer yard requirements, as a way to say, if we're going to change the zoning to allow multifamily or commercial, depending on what it's adjacent to, the standards would reflect that compatibility. And that's what we've tried to do with shaped places. So I think that's the main selling point that we were looking at from the very get-go, and that's what we're going to continue to focus on in the future. But having said that, as I'm making the notes of the things that you're talking about today, you know, next year in May, we'll probably have some, we will have some new faces. And so then we'll have an opportunity to go back and say, okay, what is all that Shape Places and Shape Sioux Falls, and what does the Planning Commission do? What does the Board of Budget? We'll have that dialogue once again, and we need to continue to have those new dialogues, because people change, neighborhoods change, and we lose track of kind of the history of why we've done something a certain way.
Okay. Mike, with that being said, I sent you some information here the other day on some properties off of 57th and Louise. Could we discuss that a little bit on what happened that with the property owners putting in their request and that being turned down? I believe it's an area where planning is looking to do work-live type of area.
I did not bring that with me, but if you want to talk about it now or later on, as I recall, we're talking about the West 57th Street area, and we've had discussions, I would say over the past year, about you've got a mix of multifamily residential, some commercial, some institutional uses, and there's been asks about would the city support going to more commercial zoning? Is that?
Yeah, there was commercial, retail.
Yep.
And residential, I believe,
And
was a mix.
we've kind of laid out, and again, I can show you what we've told people of where we would support maybe the boundaries of expanding the commercial. But when we have areas that have already been established as multifamily apartments, and then we're going to change a lot in between those to commercial, maybe that's part of the discussion. But I guess I would like to maybe get together with you more specifically on that one.
I brought
Then we can sure bring that back to the whole group and maybe give a more explanation.
Jameson in on that also.
Okay.
And we had a brief discussion, and I know he spoke with the property owners too, and, you know, taking a look at the properties and everything out there, and I guess I have some major questions on how we look at that major corridor of 57th Street and why we wouldn't allow retail or commercial along that major corridor there.
That kind of goes back to the earlier question. Okay, how do neighbors know what's going to happen? So if you come in now and you see the zoning map of that West 57th area, and it shows it's going to be this, this, and this, a developer comes in and says, well, now I want to change it to something else.
Well, I think that started as a PD, and I'm not sure how the zoning changed, but I don't believe that the property owners put in a request for zoning, so maybe that was changed during Shape Places.
Okay.
Because we did rezone a lot of areas that were, you know, either agricultural or PD districts.
Well,
So,
again, I'll sit down and go through the specifics of that one if you'd like, and then
I'd
we can
appreciate
sure
that.
bring it back to the whole group as another example.
Yeah, I think
Be
this
happy
would
to
be
do
a
that. Yep.
great example as we grow and,
Okay.
you know, we have to mix residential with the business that is over there and everything. I just thought it's a real interesting discussion for that. Any other questions?
Thank you for this chance, and we'll continue to have these open discussions. I think it's a good forum to do that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other issues that need to be brought up at this time by the council? Okay, with that, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.